Welcome to ChinaPower. I'm Bonnie Lin, your host, and in this podcast, we dissect critical issues underpinning China as a global power. So today I am joined by Ambassador Edgard Kagan, who is Senior Advisor and Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He most recently served as U.S. Ambassador to Malaysia and previously served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for East Asia and Oceania at the National Security Council. In this episode, we'll discuss the recent Trump-Xi meeting. Edgard, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Bonnie. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you because we had a quick discussion on Friday before the fact sheet was out, as the sort of, things were still coming out before the president's second interview was out. And so I feel like we've both had a chance to digest a little bit more over the weekend, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Edgar. And as you mentioned, I think you've been doing quite a bit of media already, almost the entire last week. So this, hopefully, we'll be able to discuss some of the new dynamics. But before we do that, I do want to ask you, as you look at what's coming out of the summit, was there anything that really surprised you from what you've seen or what you've heard?
So a couple of things on that. First, what surprised me the most is that we were so slow to get our fact sheet out. And I think that, throughout the summit, the Chinese were moving much faster to get readouts released, to get their version out. And I think that, frankly, the U.S. was hampered by the fact that the Chinese had a lot more information out faster than we did. And so that surprised me, because I think it's fairly well known that when you do one of these things, speed counts, and it's important to be out quickly with your version of what was discussed and what happened. Now, to be completely fair to the people who are involved with this, many of whom I know and I've worked with over the years, and who are by and large, I think, quite talented and know this stuff, I think that they were operating under a couple of constraints. I think the first and the most important one was that the president was doing his own interviews, and that he did the one with Sean Hannity and he did the one with Brett Baier. And I think that that always has a bit of a chilling effect, because nobody wants to be out with something that in any way, form, or shape contradicts the president. But the reality is that the Chinese basically got their versions out faster, in more detail, and that helped drive press coverage, and I think shaped a narrative that wasn't as good for the White House as it could have been had they been out faster with their version.
And to your point, Edgar, we did see President Trump speaking to the media very quickly. So in many ways, President Trump got his message out, and you saw the fact sheets incorporating many of the points that he said during those media interviews.
It's true, and that's a very powerful thing. And the problem is the level of detail. The Chinese readouts came across as being much more detailed. And obviously, the president makes news no matter what. And I think his view is that he's better at working the media than anyone else. And so he wants to take the lead on it. But the fact that the Chinese had their readouts out so quickly, and that there was a clear difference between what they were saying and what we were saying, I think actually didn't work in our advantage. And so, what you basically had was the Chinese media narrative was adopted earlier and a little bit more completely by the, non-Chinese media than it would normally have been, at least in my view.
And let me just follow up on that. You mentioned there was a clear difference in what the Chinese were saying and what we were saying. And there was a Chinese narrative that was adopted more by the media. What was the differences, or what did you view as the major differences between the two sides?
I think the major differences were that the Chinese were very careful not to have specific commitments and specific numbers. And so when the president was talking and other people in the U.S. delegation were talking, it was clear that there was a difference between what we were saying was discussed and had been agreed to and what the Chinese were saying. I think that if we'd put out our own written response to the Chinese faster, I think that we probably would have had a little bit less time, because what happened was that the Chinese were out faster than we were. There was a chance for things to marinate a little bit. And then they, focused on what the president said, but the president in his interviews didn't go into the level of detail on all the issues that the Chinese did. So, this is something, it's always a challenge on how you do this. This is something where, at least in my view, it would have been worth it to try and get some level of understanding and coordination on what they were saying, particularly on things like ag purchases, aircraft purchases. And, I believe that these things were discussed. My sense is that there was agreement, if only because there was prep on this for a long time, done by Secretary Bessent and his team, by Ambassador Jameson Greer and his team, working with their Chinese counterparts, led primarily by Vice Premier He Lifeng. But obviously, it would have made a difference to get more specifics from the Chinese. And in that regard, we did give the Chinese their formulation of constructive strategic stability in our fact sheet, which my assumption is that they really, really wanted. I would have expected we could have gotten some more specifics on details surrounding purchases and economic commitments in return for that.
So I want to follow up on two things. The first is why you think the Chinese did not provide specific commitments and numbers. Do you think it's because the Chinese side wants to leave it flexible in terms of what they actually deliver, or do you think that indicates that maybe we don't necessarily have agreement yet on the specific numbers between the two sides?
I'll be honest, I don't know. My expectation, based on how these things have worked in the past, is usually the Chinese have been willing to give numbers. Now, they haven't always lived up to that, and that's caused friction. And one of the reasons for the creation of this Board of Trade is to try and manage the implementation of that. But it's obviously harder to manage the implementation when it looks like there isn't a clear commitment. My guess is there actually was discussion of this in the meetings, and that there was like a general sense of agreement on this. But I think that it's a problem for us that the Chinese haven't yet actually shown their hand about what they believe they've committed to. I think that this is because the summit, there was a lot of preparation that was done on the economic track. It looked like it was in pretty good shape. The developments surrounding Iran, I think, changed that. Some of the friction surrounding sanctions and the saying that Chinese companies shouldn't comply with sanctions probably was a bit of a disruption. I'm not on the inside, so I don't know what exactly happened. But clearly, what you would want in an ideal set of circumstances is both sides saying more or less the same thing about these commitments. Not getting that, in my view, is a problem for us. It's not a huge problem, and it's a manageable one, but it's not, in an ideal world, how you'd want things to go.
I mean, one other possibility of why we don't see specific commitments from the Chinese side is maybe, as you suggested, that we did have agreements privately, but the Chinese are wary of how stable the relationship will be moving forward. So they don't necessarily want to commit to those numbers publicly, because that would mean even if there are tensions or problems in the relationship, they would still be, at least on the record, having to deliver them.
Look, Bonnie, I understand that argument. It may be, it's been 3.5 years since I've been in a meeting with Xi Jinping. So, I'm not going to pretend that I have the kind of firsthand expertise that I wish that I did. But my view is that it actually makes them more vulnerable, because no one really knows what they committed to. If the U.S. side believes that they committed to these numbers, and it's worth noting they haven't said these numbers aren't true. which is something that, in some circumstances you could imagine happening if they thought it was complete vaporware. I think that it actually opens the door for more friction than it does that to managing friction or avoiding being committed. As you know, Bonnie, the Chinese are past masters at saying, oh, this terrible thing you just did obviates and eliminates any responsibility for us to follow through on our commitments. So this is always one of the problems of dealing with China is that China is always able to, create a justification for whatever it chooses to do. I'm sure they feel the same way about us. And, the fact is they haven't felt obligated to follow through even on numbers they've announced in the past.
Great. So, second question I want to follow up with you on is what you mentioned earlier that the U.S. side gave the Chinese what Xi Jinping proposed as the new vision for U.S.-China relations, which was a relationship of constructive strategic stability. What I found interesting was in the White House readout, it said that the two sides should build a constructive relationship of strategic stability on the basis of fairness and reciprocity. So it does seem at least the U.S. side added the fairness and reciprocity. And I didn't see the U.S. side at least echoing the four specific aspects of strategic stability, in which was in the Xi Jinping and Chinese readouts. So from your perspective, is this the two sides converging on a term for characterizing the U.S.-China relationship, but actually diverging in terms of what this term means? Or do you think there's more convergence than what I see so far?
I was a little surprised that we put constructive relationship of strategic stability more or less as the first bullet point in the fact sheet. Now, it's absolutely true. On the basis of fairness of fairness and reciprocity is in our version, and that modifies it to some degree. But the reality is that the Chinese care very, very much about these sorts of constructs. And if you look carefully over the years, each side has tried to do this. Usually the other side doesn't adopt it. I was around at the time that Bob Zoellick was pushing the responsible stakeholder narrative. And, the Chinese were very careful not to, I should say, it took them a long time to be comfortable with the term. And I don't think they ever actually put it down and said China agrees it will be a responsible stakeholder, though they did sort of acknowledge that they were okay with the construct eventually. My view on this is actually a big thing for them that we're using and saying that the president agreed with Chairman Xi on this, even modified by fairness and reciprocity, which I'm sure the Chinese would say, of course, it should be fair and reciprocal. It's just a question of whose definition of fairness and whose definition of reciprocal. I think that's it's a big give for them, and it would be one thing if we'd gotten something comparable on, say, Iran in their various statements. They basically repeated what they've said before, which is not, it's not different from what's in the fact sheet. I mean, the Chinese have long opposed Iran having a nuclear weapon, and they're publicly on record calling for the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and publicly on record as opposing tolls, in part because that would probably cost them the most. The other thing that was interesting, and I think a lot of people commented on, is confirming the shared goal of denuclearizing North Korea. Again, what's interesting is the White House chose to highlight this. I'm absolutely sure that this is the Chinese position. And the reason is the Chinese have not ever suggested that they've changed their, quote unquote, long-term goal of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. I'm sure they didn't say denuclearize North Korea. But I found it interesting that we put that up front and center. So, I think it's clear she really wants this constructive relationship of strategic stability. We decided to give that to them. I'm surprised that we put that in President Trump's words in the fact sheet. But and I'm particularly surprised that we don't seem to have gotten any major concessions from the Chinese in return.
So can I follow up on that? So at least looking at the U.S. fact sheet, it doesn't seem like there was anything else from the U.S. side in which we gave them aside from this relabeling of the relationship, right? Everything else in the U.S. fact sheet is about what China is going to buy, what China is going to do, China restoring access. Do you see anything, whether that's in the Chinese fact sheet or elsewhere, that the United States gave China?
So I think that there's things that point to this. The Board of Investment language, government to government forum for discussing investment related issues, leaves ambiguous, like going in which direction. My understanding is the Chinese had pushed for greater clarity, particularly with regard to CFIUS approvals from the Board of Investment. I think they didn't get that. I think what is also interesting is the construct on rare earths. And it says China will address U.S. concerns. And that's interesting because it doesn't suggest that this is in the president's agreed, which would have been a stronger construct. And obviously, there's nothing in there that suggests that, or there's nothing in what the Chinese have said that really gets into this level of detail. I think, typically in a fact sheet, you would emphasize what you got. So if the White House does a fact sheet, usually this emphasizes what we are getting from a foreign partner. So I'm not really surprised it doesn't talk about U.S. concessions. I think when you compare what the Chinese have put out and what we've put out, what's clear is the Chinese haven't publicly committed to the key section on economic aims. And to me, that's a bit it's a bit surprising.
Fascinating. So what you're suggesting is at least what we're listing all the specific details on the economic section in terms of purchases, whether that's the Boeing aircraft or the agricultural products or even the beef. It's not necessarily clear that, at least publicly, that's what the Chinese committed, even though it's possible that they had private discussions and
Look,
there was some level of agreement.
I believe that they gave some assurances on this stuff. I don't
Right.
think the trip would have happened if they hadn't made some sort of agreement or assurance on these things. And look, these are all things that are well in the zone of what the Chinese are able to do and what they've done before. So I believe, I don't believe the White House is making this up. I think the White House is very confident the Chinese have agreed to this. But obviously, it would be much more persuasive if this was reflected in a Chinese document. However, I would have wanted to get more from the Chinese. And what I see is that by giving them constructive relationship with strategic stability on a document that came out 2 days after the president's visit ended, I feel like that's something that they really wanted. And I would have expected that we could have gotten a few more commitments from the Chinese publicly in return for them.
Okay. I do want to follow up on both Iran and North Korea, maybe Iran first, since that was a huge priority for the United States. So we see in the fact sheet a lot of what President Trump has already said publicly to the media. To what extent do you think this statement on Iran represents China giving anything, or does it just represent what China's policy was even before the trip? Like, to what extent did we move the needle at all on Iran?
So it's a very good question, Bonnie. And again, the honest answer is that it's very, very hard to know unless you were actually in the meeting. And I know that there were two meetings. There was one larger meeting, what we would call expanded bilat, and then a restricted bilat on Friday. And even the expanded bilat wasn't that big. in historical terms, on the one that took place on Thursday. And then the Friday, the president and the chairman had a lunch after the visit to Zhongnanhai. And so my guess is that's where some of the most serious discussion took place, in part because the president, I think, is always a little bit more comfortable if there are fewer people in the room when he's talking, when he's having a really serious conversation. And that's pretty consistent with all presidents. My take is that the conversation must have gone fairly well, because I have a very hard time believing that President Trump would leave speaking so highly of the visit if he'd been shut down. What's in the fact sheet are things that I said before, the Chinese have said in the past, about not having a nuclear weapon and reopening the Straits of Hormuz. And they've had it in Xi's words. And also this language on tolling, I think, is very consistent with their longstanding position. So these things, I believe that they discussed them, and that this is a Chinese position. My sense is the discussion must have been broader, and it must have been relatively positive for the president to have come out being as positive as he was about the visit. So my guess is that Chairman Xi essentially said that he's ready to exert influence and leverage over Iran. Now, what that means is always up in the air. I've been in meetings where Chinese leaders have said that they're going to put pressure on North Korea, and it's possible they do, but that doesn't translate into North Korea doing what they want. And how hard China will push on these things with regard to Iran, I think is very much up in the air, but I would keep my expectations relatively low. Unfortunately for the United States, the Iranian public narrative seems to be the visit went well from their standpoint. Um, of course, they have an interest in saying that. They don't want to suggest that, China's now arrayed against them. But it probably would be a better sign for us if the Iranians were quiet or worried than if they were coming out and saying that actually they're ready to expand the relationship with China, things are going well, blah, blah, blah.
I mean, what are some of the ways that you expect or think China could put, it seems like at this point, quiet pressure on Iran? Would it be maybe buying less Iranian oil? But I think that would be trackable, right? So maybe empowering Pakistan more? I mean, I'm just trying to think, what are the ways in which China can deliver a bit in terms of what it promised or what Xi Jinping promised President Trump, but also not undermine the Iranian public narrative?
Well, I think that the first thing that the Chinese can do is tell the Iranians, sign an agreement, get this done, end this. And my guess is that that's more or less the Chinese view, that the Iranians should sign. And I think they probably, my guess is that she told President Trump, you really need to give them something that they can sign and just get this thing over with. I think I note that the U.S. readout says Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. The Chinese, when the Iranian foreign minister Araghchi was there 2 weeks ago, the Chinese basically said they support Iran's right to reprocess or to civilian nuclear program. And that is something that, as I understand it, the current proposals from the U.S. do not have, and it's clear that we oppose. So what is interesting here is, and this is why I think this is accurate, the White House readout doesn't say Iran cannot have a nuclear program, because I don't think the Chinese would have agreed to that. It says they cannot have a nuclear weapon. So I think that what the Chinese can do is they can tell the Iranians, knock it off, you got to sign. I don't think that it's a question of telling them, if you don't do this, then we will stop doing this, we'll stop doing that. There's plenty of things the Chinese can do that send a strong signal that they're supportive of the broader goal of getting an agreement quickly, they can slow down purchases. And my guess is, look, as a practical matter, they have, because there's so little getting out. They can slow down their own exports to Iran. They can do high-profile stuff with some of the other Gulf states. So my guess is that they have ways of making clear their views. The big question mark is how much Iran will listen.
So I do want to follow up really quickly on Iran and then move to North Korea, as you mentioned. In terms of what the Trump administration or President Trump may have actually said, it's really interesting that a lot of the media have been reporting statements from Trump officials saying that President Trump didn't actually ask Xi Jinping anything, and at most it was asking Xi Jinping to not provide weapons to Iran. Do you think President Trump went in with no ask of Xi Jinping, or did he have asked, but he wasn't explicit about that? I'm just trying to understand why the United States was characterizing our position this way.
My guess is that President Trump was very sensitive to being portrayed as sort of being desperate for help. And, in the same way, I don't think that Chairman Xi specifically asked the president not to provide arms for Taiwan. And part of that's the dynamic of these meetings. In general, leaders don't like to be put in a position where they ask for something that they don't get it, because that affects the rest of the dynamic for the meetings. I think that what's more often the case is they lay out their position and then see, does the other side respond. My guess is the president talked at some length about Iran, laid out what he's trying to accomplish. She listened, made the statements on that we see in the U.S. fact sheet, and my guess is he said that he will do what he can to try and get Iran to sign an agreement, a fair agreement that ends the conflict. I don't think he committed to, I will push Iran to agree to your terms. That would be very much out of character, at least based on my own experience. And I don't think that he said, no, I want nothing to do with this. This is your problem. I think he listened. He stated China's basic view, which is, over and over, this, I've been in meetings where this is what the Chinese do: is you say, we need this. And they say, we oppose North Korea having a nuclear weapon. We oppose Iran having nuclear weapons. We believe in the, international law. We want the straits reopened, whatever the hell it is. And at the same time, and so this allows the president to say, I didn't ask. Because if he asks and gets a no, or gets a no response, obviously that's not great. But I think that it allows him to say, I'm confident that the Chinese have a basic understanding of our position and that they support many of the same things that we do.
And on North Korea, you mentioned the U.S. fact sheet mentioned denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And here I have to bring in the work that our esteemed colleague Victor Cha has in Foreign Affairs, in which he published, and he argued that perhaps denuclearization is no longer a reasonable goal for North Korea. What is your view on this, on why the United States still remains set on this goal? And from my understanding, the Chinese have also been careful to try to not use the word denuclearization as much when it comes to North Korea. Is this still realistic, and what is the administration trying to do?
I was a little surprised that we chose to highlight this. My guess is it means, first of all, and I mean, it's worth keeping in mind, the first Chinese readout that they put out after the first day said that the leaders had talked about North Korea. Or it was about the Korean Peninsula. And I would note that, I would be willing to bet virtually any sum of money that I have that the Chinese did not say denuclearize North Korea. They said denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. Our view is that when you say that, you're only referring to North Korea because the ROK doesn't have nuclear weapons, and we have removed nuclear weapons from the peninsula. But I think that what this is, and look, I'm not surprised this is a Chinese position. The Chinese have a lot of reasons for not wanting to accept a nuclear North Korea, in no small part because of the signals it sends about the ability of other countries to go nuclear. The Chinese position has always been North Korea shouldn't have nuclear weapons. When they tested, the Chinese actually protested and were critical. They've been critical over the years when North Korea has actually tested. Now, you're absolutely right. They've de-emphasized this mainly because North Korea has been so clear in basically saying we're a nuclear state. That's not going to change. And the Chinese, I'm sure, don't want to pick at scabs when they have other issues to manage in the relationship. But I think what's interesting is that we put this out. My guess is that this is because we don't want to agree to a nuclear North Korea, except as part of a broader set of discussions if we were to do that in the first place. And I'm not sure that that's where the president is. It's worth keeping in mind that the last round of engagement between President Trump and Kim Jong-un really fell down on the question of denuclearization. So I don't know if the president's ready to accept a nuclear North Korea. But what I could tell you this is you wouldn't give that away in a joint statement with, or not joint, a fact sheet from discussions with China. You would try and say, this is still our goal, so that if you were to hypothetically change that, it would be something that hopefully you get something in return for. Now, again, I don't want to suggest that I think that's where this is going. I think the president really thinks North Korea shouldn't have nuclear weapons and is going to be very reluctant to do that. And I think that, Dr. Victor Cha, our esteemed colleague and boss, I think has written a very, very thoughtful piece. And it's a significant departure from where, many people who've worked on the issue were 20 years ago. You can argue that it's the right approach. You can argue it's the wrong approach. But regardless, I find it inconceivable that the U.S. gives away something so significant in a fact sheet from discussions and with meetings with Xi.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. But I do want to also mention one topic that was not in the U.S. fact sheet, but was in the Chinese readouts, as well as President Trump's media statements, which is Taiwan. And I want to get your read on this in light of what you've seen in terms of what's out there on the Chinese side. But also, we saw, I think on Sunday night, I want to say, a report that certain unnamed Trump advisors became more worried about Taiwan after the President Trump's meeting with Xi. And there was reporting that, or a concern from their end, that Xi might make a move on Taiwan in the next 5 years. How do you put all of this together, and what is your read?
My read is that a lot of the people around the president are on record as having serious concerns with regard to Taiwan. I think that some of the things that were said about Taiwan put together might create some nervousness. And there's an attempt to try and lay the groundwork for correcting the record or adjusting the policy. My take actually is I'm less worried on Taiwan than I think many other people who follow this in the United States are. Because I think that if you put the two readouts together, or rather you put the Wang Yi's relatively detailed Q&A with the press, along with what the president said in his two interviews, you can see a couple things. First of all, Wang Yi was very careful not to say that there was agreement on the most sensitive points of the discussion. He didn't say the U.S. has agreed not to sell weapons. He didn't say the U.S. agrees to oppose Taiwan independence. He said that our impression was that the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence, doesn't want to see an independent Taiwan. That is very different than having the president say that. And there were people who were worried that he would somehow change the declaratory policy on Taiwan, or even the Chinese saying, we discussed it and agreed on this. So to me, what it really says is the Chinese made their case on Taiwan. And, look, anybody who's been in these kinds of meetings has heard them do this over the years. They've been doing it very consistently since the Reagan administration. There was a bit of a hiatus where it was less important. But when you had the Jiang Zemin visit in 1997 and the Clinton trip to China in 1998, these were the kinds of discussions that took place, at least as I understand it. And the structure is this. The Chinese lay out how sensitive Taiwan is, how important it is, how much they oppose Taiwan independence, how Taiwan independence would be a red line. The U.S. should be careful not to support bad elements in Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. Typically, the U.S. does two things. One is you listen. You hear the Chinese out because they're going to say this no matter what. There is a huge amount of political pressure in their system to say this. And then typically you do one of two things. Sometimes you just say, look, thank you very much. It's great to hear your views. The U.S. one China policy based on the Taiwan Relations Act and the three communiques remains in place. In more recent years, sometimes you've added 6 assurances, though I would note that that was not part of the catechism until probably about 10 years ago in terms of what you said in meetings with Chinese. And you then try and move on. I strongly suspect that the president didn't discuss the details of specific arms sales, which is actually what's in the 6 assurances. However, I suspect that the president said something along the lines of what he said publicly, which is, look, we're not looking for trouble on Taiwan. Now, I think that the problem is that I think the president, it seems from the Chinese readout and from the different readouts that have come out from the U.S. side, I think the president handled it relatively well in the meetings. The problem is that his sort of exegesis in the interviews does raise questions about his commitment and how he sees the issue in ways that, in my view, aren't helpful. Now, look, let's be honest. If you'd gone to any of his recent predecessors as president and said, hey, are you looking for a war over Taiwan? I don't think Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama, or Biden would have said, no, we're looking for a war. I mean, clearly nobody wants a war between China and Taiwan. Nobody wants the U.S. to get involved. I mean, that is not what we're looking for. However, I think that it is clear that most of them would have probably said something more along the lines of it's important that China behaves in the right way. And what's interesting is there's a bit of that where the president essentially said his decisions on arms sales will be guided by what China does and China's actions. That's actually kind of consistent. And if you want to be a stickler for this stuff, that more or less is a reflection of what's in the 3rd communique, where basically, we say that China's policies and what China does and its commitment to peaceful reunification will guide what we do. So my view is that the real problem here is that by going a little bit further, by saying the last thing we want is a war 9,500 miles away, saying they're 67 miles apart, we're 9,500 miles away, that's extremely unhelpful. Because it does suggest that the U.S. and that this president may not be quite as committed. However, I would just say a couple of things. One, I don't think China is going to make a decision on whether or not to use force on the basis of what one American president says or doesn't say in a sort of passing statement. I mean, I think the Chinese are very, very well aware of the risks. So I don't think that this makes a huge difference. But look, I think you have to be honest and say the way the president talked about this raises questions that, from a U.S. standpoint, over the years, we've always believed are better not raised.
Thank you, Echo. So, one final question to wrap up the podcast. So, as we look at everything as a whole, where do you put U.S. China relations? How would you characterize the relationship? And how would you describe what you expect in the next couple of months to come from the potential three other meetings between President Trump and Xi?
So, look, those are exactly the right questions, Bonnie. And I would say what we see here is both sides signaling that they want a better and a more stable relationship. And I think that that on its own is quite important given the kind of turbulence we've seen in the last, let's say, 8 years. I don't think one meeting is going to be enough to completely change the trajectory. It may be that if we really have 4 meetings this year, that that will do it. And at the end of those 4 meetings, we'll be able to have few more data points. But my view is that the meeting in Busan was essentially about stopping a downward spiral. This meeting is about signaling that both leaders want stability. And, I've read and listened to a lot of stuff saying, oh, China ran the table. The Chinese actually, didn't treat the president well. I don't buy that at all. I think that if you look closely at how the visit went, I think it was very clear the Chinese gave this top tier status. They tried every way they could to signal that they see this as an extraordinarily important relationship. Now, some of it is the Chinese want to show that this is a relationship of equals. The reality is they've always wanted that. There's never been a time where the Chinese wanted to suggest that they sort of saw the U.S. as the big brother or senior partner or big sister in the relationship. They've always been very sensitive on this point. So what I think you have here is each leader doing several things. One, sending a message to their public and to their governments that they support a positive relationship, a constructive relationship of strategic stability, or whatever the hell the exact term of art is. And I think that's actually quite important because there has been a sense that the leaders on both sides actually are fine with a more confrontational relationship. So I think that symbolism is important. I think it also signals that there is going to be a continued truce on the economic side, or at least that's the intention. And again, both sides have to follow through. Both systems are, famously a little unwieldy, and there's a lot of moles to whack if you're trying to move everything in one direction. And it's not totally clear that we're going to do all the things the Chinese want, or the Chinese are going to do all the things that we want. But I think that this is significant because you've got the leaders signaling that they want this. And the other 2 points are each leader is also signaling that they are the only one who can really deal effectively with the other side. And you can agree, disagree with that, but each wants to highlight the strength of the personal relationship and that they are the only one who can really get the other side to deliver in ways that are meaningful for their own peoples. And the third piece, and I think this is very important, I think this is ultimately, at least in my view, going to be one of the trickiest things for this, particularly for the United States, is the messaging to the rest of the world. I mean, essentially, the rest of the world, in my view, doesn't want the relationship to be too confrontational. They also don't want it to be too good. And I think that if you were the Philippines, if you are Japan, and you're dealing with real pressure from China, you're going to wonder, what exactly does this mean for the U.S. willingness to stand up to China on things that historically we've done and that are important to you? On the other hand, you are probably relieved that you're not going to get dragged into a more confrontational relationship with China because of what the U.S. is doing. So I think the key is going to be how the U.S. messages and engages with allies and partners. I think it's a very positive sign that the president called Prime Minister Takaichi and Chancellor Merz on from the plane as he was leaving China. And I think that there will hopefully be more of that in the coming days and weeks, and that we're able to send a very clear message that this doesn't come at the expense of our allies and partners.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Edgar. There's still, of course, more for us to follow in the coming days as we observe potentially more outcomes or more results of this summit. But it's, as you mentioned, it sets a good first meeting of potentially four for this year, and it does bring more stability to U.S.-China relations. Edgar, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Bonnie. It's always a pleasure, and I've really enjoyed this.